A lonely Apache paid for a bride only to be met by a widow with secrets and scars. Colorado Territory. Spring 1872. The land rolled out in golden silence. Dust hung heavy in the desert air as wagons rattled past the busy depot, carrying whispers of new beginnings and buried pasts. Among the crowd stood a solitary Apache rancher, hardened by silence and years of loneliness, clutching the papers that promised him a young bride to share his land and lighten his heart. But when the train doors opened, it was not innocence that stepped onto the platform. It was a widow draped in sorrow, her eyes haunted, her scars half hidden, her secrets heavy as stone. What began as a bargain of necessity soon became a test of trust, redemption, and the fragile hope that even the deepest wounds could be mended by love. The desert stretched wide and endless, a land of red stone and pale dust where the wind carried no voices but its own. To the north, mesas stood like old gods, scarred and unmoving, their shadows falling long across the scrub. To the south, dry washes cut like scars through the earth, remembering storms that came only once in a season and sometimes not at all. It was a hard country, a country that took more than it gave, and yet it was the only home Taza had ever known. He was Apache born beneath the wide sky, raised among warriors who once rode swift ponies over every ridge and canyon. But those days were gone. The cavalry had come, the forts had risen, the treaties had been broken as quickly as they were made. His people were scattered now, some on reservations, others hidden in the mountains, and many buried beneath the soil they had sworn to defend. Taza remained a survivor, though survival often felt like a poor substitute for living. He was not old, though the years weighed heavy on him. 30 winters had sharpened his face into lines of quiet sternness. His hair was long, bound with rawhide, his body lean and strong from hunting and riding. Yet when he sat alone by the fire at night, staring into the flames, he felt the emptiness pressing on him. No laughter of children, no soft murmur of a woman tending the meal, no voice to answer when he spoke aloud to the stars. Loneliness was a hunger he could not fill. The other men he once hunted with had taken wives or else fallen in battle. The women of his band had been carried away or married into other clans, leaving him without kin close enough to call his own. For years he told himself he needed no one, that a warrior stood strongest when he stood alone. But each season proved the lie. He wanted more than the silence. One evening, after returning from a long hunt, he rode into a border town where traders met Apache and settlers alike. The town stank of smoke, horses, and whiskey. But it was there he first heard of a man who arranged marriages across the frontier. A strange thing, perhaps, to pay for a bride, but the broker boasted he could find women from the East, from Mexico, even from Europe, all eager for husbands who would give them a home. Taza listened with cool detachment, as though the idea were beneath him. Yet in his chest the thought burned. Could such a thing truly be? That a man could trade goods, furs, silver, horses, and receive in return not just a wife, but companionship, warmth, the chance for children who might carry his blood into a future beyond the shadow of conquest? The broker eyed him carefully. "You got the look of a man who spends his nights with only the coyotes for company," he said. "Lonely men make good husbands. They're hungry enough to treat a woman right." Taza did not answer, but the words cut deep. For weeks afterward, he thought of it while tending his horses, while tracking deer, while sitting before the fire with only silence for company. His pride warred against his longing. To buy a bride, was that not dishonor? Yet was it not also dishonor to live half a life, empty, when he might still build a family? Finally, he gathered what he had to give. The finest pelts from his hunts, a young and strong horse, and silver he had kept hidden away for years. When he rode once more into the border town, the broker grinned at the sight of him. "I knew you'd be back," the man said. Taza only nodded. His voice was steady, though inside his heart beat hard as a war drum. "I will trade," he said. "Find me a woman who can share my fire." It was not a decision made lightly. It was the choice of a man who had walked too long in silence, who yearned for a voice to break it, and who believed, perhaps, foolishly, that happiness could be bought with the weight of silver and the promise of a home. And so the wheels of fate began to turn. The deal was struck in the back room of a dusty trading post, where the smell of tobacco smoke clung to the rafters and lamplight flickered against rough planked walls. Taza sat cross-legged on the floor, his blanket folded neatly beneath him, the quiet weight of his presence filling the room. Across from him, the marriage broker leaned back in a chair, his boots propped against the edge of the table. Between them lay the offerings of a man who had no other coin, 2 bundles of fine fox pelts, soft and gleaming, a pouch heavy with silver trinkets hammered from bullets and trade bars, and tied outside to a hitching post, a strong roan horse with eyes bright as flint. The broker whistled low as he rubbed one of the pelts between his fingers. "This is fine work. Eastern women will like a husband who can provide such things. You'll have no trouble." He set the fur aside with care, though his eyes gleamed like a crow's. Taza said nothing. He knew better than to trust men who traded in words and promises. Still, he had come of his own choosing. Hope had brought him here, and hope was a dangerous thing. It was the only hunger sharper than loneliness. "What kind of woman do you want?" the broker asked, leaning forward. "Some want wives for work, some for children, some for the bed." "I can find any sort you like." Taza lifted his gaze, steady as a drawn bow. "A woman who will not fear me. One who will keep my fire warm. One who will bear children, if the Creator allows." The broker chuckled. "Practical. I like that. There's a widow in Missouri, too old. A girl from Boston, soft as butter, but she's got no strength for the frontier. A Mexican senorita, proud as a hawk, she'd claw your eyes before she washed your clothes. No, no. I think I know the one for you." He shuffled through a stack of worn letters, each with a name, an age, and a few clumsy words of longing written in an unfamiliar hand. Taza watched the man with suspicion. These letters felt like spirits' voices torn from their homes, carried across miles of land, hoping to be answered. Finally, the broker tapped one letter with a grin. "Here, 22 years. Brown hair. Strong, it says here. Used to farm work. Wants a man who won't beat her like her father did. Sounds like you, huh? A quiet man. You'll get along." Taza took the letter into his hands, though he could not read the English words. He studied the shapes of the letters, black marks on yellowed paper, as though they held the truth. He could not tell if the broker lied, but he heard something in the man's tone, something that made his heart lift just a little. "When will she come?" he asked. The broker spread his hands. "Depends on the wagon trains. A few months, maybe. You'll get word before she arrives. Don't you worry. She'd be worth the wait." Taza nodded, though patience was not his gift. He had waited long years already, waited for battles to end, for peace to come, for his people to find their place in a world that no longer wanted them. What was a few more months? He rose, wrapping the blanket back around his shoulders. The broker's eyes lingered greedily on the horse outside. "You'll not regret this," he said. "Lonely men make good husbands. You'll see." Taza left the trading post with the sun sinking low over the desert. The air was warm against his face, but in his chest a cold unease twisted alongside the fragile bloom of hope. He had traded well, so the broker said, but what could any man truly know of a stranger who lived half a continent away? As he mounted his horse and turned toward his camp, he looked out across the land. The mesas burned red with the last light, and the sky stretched endless above. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a woman carried her own secrets, her own scars. Soon she would be bound to his fate. For the first time in many years, Taza felt the stirring of anticipation. Not for war, not for the hunt, but for the possibility that his fire would no longer burn alone. And so he carried hope with him, heavy as the weapons at his side, fragile as the wind that moved across the desert. The day she came was neither bright nor gentle. A gray sky hung low over the settlement, and the wind carried dust across the main street like restless spirits. Wagons creaked into town, heavy with goods and weary travelers, their wheels grinding over packed earth. Taza stood at the edge of it all, silent, his arms folded across his chest as he watched. He had been told to expect her with this train, and though he kept his face still, his pulse moved quick beneath the skin. For weeks he had imagined what form hope might take, perhaps a young woman with eyes as wide as the prairie, or one with laughter quick on her lips. He pictured her stepping down from the wagon with a shy smile, setting her hand in his, ready to begin the life they had both agreed to. But when the last wagon rolled to a halt and the passengers began to climb down, the woman who looked for him was not the one he had imagined. She was veiled in black, her posture stiff, her movements careful as though her bones ached. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, and when she lifted her face, he saw not youth but weariness. She was not a girl, but a woman who had carried sorrow longer than laughter. A thin scar ran from the corner of her jaw to the line of her neck, half hidden beneath the edge of the veil. Taza's eyes narrowed. This was no bright-eyed bride from the east. This was someone shaped by storms. The broker who had arranged the match bustled forward with too much cheer. Here she is, as promised. Come all the way to be your wife. You'll find her a good worker, strong enough for any homestead. The woman's gaze flickered to Taza, and for an instant he thought he saw fear there, or maybe mistrust. She clasped her satchel close against her side, as though it contained her very life. "You are Taza?" she asked, her voice low, husky, touched with an accent he could not place. He inclined his head once. "I am." She did not smile. She only nodded and turned her face slightly, as though bracing against something unseen. The broker clapped his hands together. "Well, there you have it. A man and wife, joined by promise and trade. You'll both find happiness, I'm sure." He spoke the words quickly, eager to be rid of the matter, eager perhaps to keep hidden whatever deception he had woven into the deal. Taza's hand tightened on the strap of his saddle. He had traded a fine horse, pelts, and silver for this woman, this widow, for he could see it in her mourning dress, in the veil she wore like a shield. No one had spoken of her being a widow. No one had spoken of scars. He felt anger rise in him, hot as the desert sun, but it burned against his own honor. He had given his word. He could not turn her away. Not when she had traveled so far, not when her eyes, though shadowed, spoke of battles fought in silence. "I will take you to my home," he said at last. His voice as flat as stone. She gave no answer, only gathered her satchel and followed him to where his horse stood waiting. He noticed how she limped, just slightly, favoring one side as though an old wound still troubled her. She climbed into the saddle without asking for help, her jaw set. They rode out of the settlement together, two strangers bound by a bargain neither fully understood. Behind them, the town shrank into dust and distance. Ahead, the desert opened wide and unforgiving. As the miles passed in silence, Taza studied her from the corner of his eye. She did not look around at the land, did not marvel at the cliffs or the sky. Instead, she kept her gaze low, her satchel pressed close, her shoulders rigid. There was strength in her. Yes, but it was the strength of someone who had endured, not someone untouched. And though he did not yet know her name, Taza understood one thing with sudden clarity. The woman who had come to share his fire was not the woman he had paid for. She was someone else entirely, someone with secrets stitched into her silence, and scars deeper than the one visible on her skin. The journey home was quiet, so quiet that even the horses seemed to sense the weight between them. The woman, his bride now, though the word felt foreign on his tongue, rode without speaking. Her veil fluttered in the dry wind, her satchel clutched tight, and every so often he caught her casting quick glances at him as though to measure the danger in his silence. When at last they reached his Campo adobe dwelling near a mesquite grove, Taza dismounted and led his horse to water. She followed, stiff-backed, standing just beyond the circle of firestones as if afraid to cross into his space. "This is my home," he said simply, gesturing to the house built of earth and stone. "It will be yours, too." She nodded, but the movement was so slight it might have been the shifting of her veil. He waited for her to say more, to give him her name at least. When no words came, he frowned. "What am I to call you?" Her lips parted, hesitated. "Eliza," she said at last, her voice rough with fatigue. "Eliza," he repeated, testing the sound. It was a name from another world, a world of churches and town bells, not one that belonged to the desert. Still, it was hers, and so he held it in his memory dot inside the house. She moved slowly, her hands brushing the clay walls, her eyes cautious as she took in the narrow bed, the small table, the neatly stacked shelves of clay jars filled with dried beans and corn. She seemed to weigh it all against some unseen measure. He set a pot of water over the fire. She did not help, nor did she sit. Instead, she hovered near the doorway, as though ready to flee. "You do not speak much," Taza said at last. "I speak when there is need," she answered. Her tone was not sharp, yet it carried an edge, as though every word she gave away cost her something. The fire crackled between them. He studied her face and the shifting light pale beneath the dust of travel, the scar along her jaw stark against her skin. Not the face of the hopeful bride he had been promised. Not the bright laughter of a woman eager for new beginnings. This was a face marked by shadows. Anger stirred in him again. He had been cheated. The broker had lied. He had traded his wealth, his pride, for a woman who came with veils, silence, and scars. "You are not what was promised," he said bluntly. Eliza's gaze hardened. For a heartbeat, he thought she would strike him with her words, or perhaps with her hands. But she only lifted her chin. "Nor were you, I imagine." The retort stung more than he expected. He pressed his lips together and turned back to the fire. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the desert night filled the silence, the chirp of crickets, the sigh of the wind through mesquite branches. Finally, Eliza crossed the threshold, set down her satchel with care, and sat at the edge of the bed. She looked small there, small and distant, though her back was straight with defiance. "You may think me a lie," she said quietly, "but I have nowhere else. If you send me away, I will not survive the road again. If you keep me, I will work. I will earn my place. That is all I can promise." Her voice trembled at the edges, but her eyes did not falter. Taza stared at her, torn between pride and compassion. He wanted to rage at the trickery, at the broker who had delivered him not the woman he imagined but this widow with haunted eyes. Yet beneath her words he heard a truth deeper than any bargain. She was not here to deceive him. She was here because she had no other choice. He turned the pot slowly, letting the steam rise. "You will stay," he said at last, his voice low. "I gave my word." "A man keeps his word," Eliza exhaled, though whether in relief or resignation he could not tell. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze falling to the earthen floor dot, and so they sat husband and wife in name, strangers in truth. Between them lay not the warmth of union but a gulf of mistrust, deep as the canyons that carved the desert. The fire burned on, casting long shadows on the walls as if to remind them both. Expectations had broken. What remained to be built would not come easily. The days that followed settled like dust, quiet but never comfortable. Eliza moved through Taza's home as though it were a place borrowed, not hers. She swept the floor, tended the fire, fetched water from the creek, but she did so with a wariness, as if expecting rebuke for every sound she made dot at night. She wrapped herself in her shawl and lay on the far side of the bed, her back turned, her breath shallow and uneven until she finally fell into restless sleep. Sometimes she woke with a start, a muffled cry caught in her throat, and her hand would fly to the satchel she kept tucked beneath her pillow. She never let it out of her reach, not even for a moment. Taza watched all this in silence. His people had taught him to read the signs others tried to hide, the twitch of a hand, the shift of an eye, the weight carried in a man's walk. Eliza carried secrets like stones, heavy and sharp. Cutting into her with every step dot in the settlement, whispers began to drift his way. A widow, they called her. A woman whose first husband had met a violent end. Some said he drank himself to death. Others claimed he was shot by raiders. A few, lowering their voices, suggested it was Eliza herself who had killed him. When Taza returned from trading one afternoon, he found Eliza bent over the fire, stirring beans in the pot. The scar on her jaw glowed red in the heat's reflection. He set down the bundle of cornmeal and watched her a long moment. "Your husband before me," he said at last. "How did he die?" Her hand stilled on the spoon. The fire popped, and the sound seemed loud in the silence that followed. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to his. "Why do you ask?" "Because others speak of it," he replied, his tone even. "Because you carry sorrow in your eyes. And because I must know the truth of the woman who shares my fire." Her lips tightened, and for a moment he thought she would refuse him. Then, with a sharp motion, she set down the spoon. "He was a cruel man," she said, her voice low. "Cruel in ways you cannot see on the skin. He drank. He struck me when the bottle was empty. He struck me when it was full. The scar you see," she touched her jaw lightly, as if the memory burned, "that was one of his gifts." Her words hung heavy in the air. Taza's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He had known men who struck women, men who wore their cruelty like a badge. Among his people such men were despised, but on the frontier he had seen too often how they thrived. Eliza's gaze flickered, uncertain. "One night," she went on, "he came at me with his belt. Something broke in me. I fought back. When it was over, he was lying still, and I was holding the iron skillet. I thought they would hang me, but the law cared little for what happened in a shack at the edge of nowhere. I buried him myself. And then I left." Her voice cracked then, just slightly, but she steadied it with effort. "That is the truth you wanted." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of beans boiling over. Taza stepped forward and pulled the pot from the flames, setting it aside. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You carry scars," he said, "on your skin, in your heart. You hide them because you think they make you weak." Her chin lifted, defiant. "They do." He shook his head once. "No, they make you strong. But strength cuts like a blade. It can wound as well as protect." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shadowed. Then she gathered her shawl around her shoulders and moved to the doorway. "Believe what you will," she said. "I have spoken enough." She stepped out into the night, leaving him alone with the fire. Taza sat down, staring into the flames. The truth she had given him was more than he expected, yet it was only part of her. She had bared her past, but not her soul. There were still secrets in the way she clutched her satchel, still shadows in the way she woke gasping from dreams she would not explain. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had tracked storms across the desert, that whatever she carried inside her had not finished shaping her fate or his. The first real test came without warning. Taza had been tracking a small herd of deer along a dry wash when the sharp cry of a distant horse spurred him into alertness. He halted, scanning the horizon. Dust swirled in the late afternoon sun, and through it came the glint of metal rifles, drawn and ready. Raiders. Eliza had been helping in the garden near the edge of camp. She saw the rising cloud and froze, the satchel still clutched to her chest. "Move!" Taza shouted, dismounting and grabbing his bow. The horse whinnied as he swung up behind him, ready for flight or fight. She hesitated, caught between fear and instinct. But fear is a powerful teacher. She snatched the heavy iron skillet from the table and followed him, feet nimble despite the weight of her skirt. The raiders appeared over the rise in jagged formation, shouting, demanding horses and supplies. Taza's hand went to the bowstring. Eliza's eyes narrowed, calculating. In that moment, she was no fragile bride but a survivor, a woman who had lived through violence before and would do so again. Taza fired first, letting an arrow streak toward the closest horseman. The man swerved and chaos erupted. He shot again, herding the raiders back toward the rise, but there were too many. Eliza swung the skillet, striking one raider across the temple with a clang that echoed in the canyon. He staggered, then fell. Another raider came close and she ducked, swinging again. Her movements were precise, almost graceful, honed by fear and necessity. Taza's heart raced, not with panic, but with recognition. The woman who had seemed fragile at camp was as fierce as any warrior he had known. And yet, their styles clashed. He moved with the calm, patient precision of a hunter. She acted on instinct and fire. They were two forces trying to occupy the same space, and nearly twice he found himself pulling her back to avoid being struck by her skillet as she pivoted to block a horseman. "Stay close," he shouted. "I can handle myself." She yelled back, her voice a mix of defiance and desperation. The argument itself was brief, replaced quickly by the necessity of survival. Arrows flew. Dust choked the air. The raiders pressed, and for a moment it seemed the wind itself sided with neither. But slowly they began to work in tandem. Taza's calculated strikes drove raiders back toward the rise. Eliza's wild, sudden swings scattered them further. Together, their actions complemented each other in ways neither had expected. When the last raider fled, limping over a ridge, the wind returned to its usual whisper, carrying the echoes of shouts and the pounding of hooves. They stood in the dust, chest heaving, hands trembling from exertion. Taza turned to her, his face a mask of exhaustion and surprise. "You didn't tell me you could fight." She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, chest rising and falling. "I didn't think it mattered." "You hit it," he said, his tone more observation than accusation. "I had to," she replied. "You do not trust me." "And if you did not, I might not have survived." The words hung heavy between them. He understood then that their mistrust had been mutual all along, his wariness born of caution, hers born of fear and experience. The clash of wounds was not just the battle with raiders, but the battle between two souls, scarred in different ways, both uncertain if the other could be trusted. Taza extended a hand to her, not as a husband demanding obedience, but as a warrior acknowledging strength. Eliza hesitated, then took it. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the quiet that followed, amid the settling dust and the fading shouts, they realized that survival demanded more than skill with weapons. It demanded cooperation, patience, and most difficult of all, trust. And as the sun dipped below the mesas, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, they began to understand that perhaps, just perhaps, trust could grow even between the most scarred of hearts. The fire burned low, embers glowing like dying stars, as Taza and Eliza sat across from each other in the small adobe dwelling. Silence had settled after the day's chaos, a weight that neither dared break. The wind whispered through the mesquite outside, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust, but inside, The only sounds were the occasional crackle of burning wood and the quiet rhythm of their breaths. Taza leaned back against the wall, arms folded, eyes fixed on the flickering light. He had seen her fight today, seen the strength, the courage, and the precision in every swing of that skillet, every step she took to evade the raiders. Yet the firelight revealed more than her physical scars. It revealed hesitation, shadows of old fears, and pain she carried with deliberate restraint. "Eliza," he said softly, "you fought well today. I should have trusted you sooner." Her gaze flickered to him, wary but not unkind. "Trust is earned," she said. "And I have not yet earned yours." Taza nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind her words. "Then tell me," he said, "everything. All that you've hidden." "I can bear it." She looked down at her hands, fingers entwined as if holding herself together. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but steady. "After my husband, after what I did, there was no one. No one to see me, no one to care. The law wouldn't, neighbors wouldn't. I left everything behind, family, friends, even my own name at times. I thought survival meant silence. It meant hiding the pieces of myself I feared would break someone else if they knew them." Her words hung in the air, as fragile as the smoke curling from the fire. Taza's eyes softened. He had known loss, known the slow erosion of hope and kin. He saw her now not as a stranger, not as the bride he had purchased, but as a soul who had weathered storms that he could scarcely imagine. "I was never cruel," she continued, "but I have scars. Some you can see, others that dwell in the dark of my mind. I feared you would leave me if you knew them all. But I cannot hide any more." Taza rose and moved closer, kneeling beside her on the floor. He reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "We are both scarred," he said. "Your past, my solitude, these are not things to hide, Eliza. They are what make us who we are. I do not see deception. I see survival, and I see strength." Tears pricked her eyes, but she did not pull away. For the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders loosened. The firelight reflected in her gaze, and in it, Taza saw vulnerability met with courage, a mirror of his own quiet endurance. Do you forgive me for hiding so much?" she asked, voice trembling. He smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and quiet admiration. "There is nothing to forgive. You hid to survive, and survival is the greatest teacher of all. You only now begin to trust me because you feel safe, and I am ready to see all of you, if you will let me." She nodded slowly. The room was still, the wind outside carrying only whispers of the desert night. For the first time since their meeting, the veil between them lifted, not completely, but enough to see each other clearly. The fire crackled once, then settled into a steady glow. Taza extended his other hand toward her, bridging the final gap between them. She placed her free hand atop it, and in that simple gesture lay unspoken promises of patience, of understanding, of shared strength. In the quiet after battle and truth, they felt the beginnings of something neither had dared hope for before, a bond forged not from dreams of perfection, but from acceptance of each other's scars. And as the night deepened, the embers casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls, Taza realized that the woman who had arrived a stranger, veiled and wary, was now slowly becoming someone who might share not only his home but his life. They did not speak more that night. Words were unnecessary. The firelight, the warmth, and the shared recognition of pain and endurance said enough. For the first time, Taza allowed himself to hope, not the fleeting hope bought with silver or pelts, but a deeper hope, one that grew from trust, truth, and the slow healing of two wounded hearts. The desert morning was soft and forgiving, a rare calm after weeks of wind and dust. The sky glowed with pale gold as the sun rose, painting the mesas in hues of amber and rose. Taza and Eliza worked side by side near the creek, filling water skins and tending the small plot of corn and beans that had become their lifeline. They moved with a quiet rhythm, each aware of the other's presence. Gone were the initial tensions, the unspoken accusations, the guarded stances. In their place was a tentative understanding, fragile yet resilient. Like the shoots of green pushing through parched soil. Eliza carried water, her hands steady, her gaze occasionally lifting to meet Taza's. There was no veil, no shield, only the raw honesty of a woman who had survived much and now chose to meet life directly. "You've grown stronger," Taza remarked, not in critique but in quiet acknowledgement. She smiled faintly. "I learned from necessity," he chuckled softly. "And from me, perhaps." Her eyes flickered, teasing despite the dust on her skin. "Perhaps," she said, and in that simple exchange, a wall broke just a little. That afternoon, Taza rode out to check the perimeter, leaving Eliza near the garden. When he returned, he found her sitting on the low stone wall, the satchel he had once feared now open beside her. Inside were seeds, a small knife, and a few personal items, objects of a life rebuilt. Modest but essential. "You carry your world in that satchel," he observed. "And now it's shared," she replied. "With you." The words, simple and unassuming, carried weight. Taza dismounted and joined her, brushing dust from his coat. For the first time, he reached out not as a protector asserting dominance, but as a partner acknowledging equality. He took her hand, lightly, testing her trust. She did not flinch. "Together," he said. "We will survive this land together." Eliza's fingers tightened around his. "Yes," she whispered. Together. It was a beginning, fragile yet undeniable. Over the next weeks, their days were filled with labor, conversation, and small acts of care. Taza taught her to track the deer and recognize the signs of predators in the brush. She taught him to prepare herbs for medicine and to listen to the land in ways he had forgotten. Slowly, they became more than two survivors sharing a fire. They became partners, relying on each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesas and painted the desert in crimson and violet, Taza and Eliza sat by the fire, the first light of stars shimmering above. He watched her tend the flames, the scars on her jaw softened in shadow, her eyes reflecting courage and tenderness alike. "You are not the bride I imagined," he said softly. "No," she agreed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But I am the one you have. And I hope that will be enough." Taza reached for her hand again, this time with no testing, no hesitation. "It is more than enough," he said. "I see you, all of you. The scars, the strength, the fear, the courage. I see it and I am glad for it." A quiet peace settled over them. Not the fleeting comfort of ease, but the deep, enduring calm of two wounded souls recognizing each other. There would still be hardships, raiders, droughts, the constant challenge of life on the frontier, but they would face them together. No longer alone. As night fully claimed the desert, Taza and Eliza leaned close, shoulders touching, sharing warmth not merely for the body but for the heart. The fire crackled, a steady companion, illuminating faces once veiled in mistrust. In that glow, two lives once broken by solitude and loss began to knit together. For the first time, Taza allowed himself to believe that a family of two, and perhaps one day more, was possible. Not bought with silver or traded goods, but built with trust, understanding, and shared scars. Eliza turned to him, eyes bright with quiet certainty. "We will face what comes," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "And we will endure, together." The fire burned low, the desert held its breath, and in that vast, unforgiving land a new bond was forged, scarred, resilient, and unbroken. Two lonely hearts had found each other, not through promises or transactions, but through courage, truth, and the slow, Steady work of learning to trust Dot, and in that trust, they found something rare, precious, and real, the beginning of a home.